Hi everyone, it's Dr. Fox, and let's talk about the pharynx. In this video, we'll describe the pharynx and any adjacent communicating spaces and how they function as part of either the respiratory or digestive systems. We'll also describe the divisions of the pharynx, their boundaries, and major contents, especially things like tonsils. So to begin, the pharynx colloquially is known as the throat. It is a shared space between respiratory and digestive systems, so oftentimes we refer to it as an aerodigestive space. It communicates to the anterior with the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, and distally, inferiorly, with the esophagus as part of the digestive system, and the larynx as part of the respiratory system. So let's take a look at the pharyngeal divisions, recalling that superiorly we have a nasopharynx. The nasopharynx is separated from the nasal cavity at the choana, and it's separated by the oropharynx by the soft palate. Next we have the oropharynx. The oropharynx is separated from the oral cavity by the palatoglossal folds, in totality the palatoglossal arch. That's the palatoglossus muscle covered by oral and pharyngeal mucosa. It's also separated distally from the laryngopharynx by the epiglottis and pharyngoepiglottic fold. The laryngopharynx is separated from the larynx by the laryngeal inlet and from the esophagus at the entrance at the inferior margin of the cricoid cartilage, which is at the distal margin of C. So let's start with the nasopharynx and work our way distally. So the nasopharynx begins at the choanae and it ends at the soft palate. And contained within are a couple of things of note. For starters, on the roof of the nasopharynx, we have a collection of lymphoid tissue, which is acapsular, which is known as the pharyngeal tonsil, or sometimes called the adenoid. So if you have ever had a friend tell you that they've had their adenoids removed, you can tell them, but you have one. Next up, lateral wall, we have this raised area surrounding a communication pathway. That communication pathway is called the pharyngotympanic tube, also known as the auditory tube, also known as the eustachian tube. This is the pathway to which your nasopharynx communicates with your middle ear. So if you've ever had that experience of your middle ears feeling full and you've swallowed or chewed on some gum and that sensation of popping, it's gone away, that pharyngotympanic tube has gone patent for a while, air has moved through it, and the pressures have equilibrated between the middle ear and the environment in which you are in. Sometimes nestled within that space is a little bit of more lymphoid tissue, acapsular lymphoid tissue that we would call the tubal tonsil. It's much smaller than the pharyngeal tonsil, however. Now let's move inferiorly and let's kind of approach this from the anterior. And so to start with the oropharynx, we have the palatoglossal folds. Palatoglossal contains the palatoglossus muscle, which runs from the palate to the tongue. That is the anterior boundary of the oropharynx, separating it from the oral cavity. And as we move posteriorly from that, we come to another fold, and that is the palatopharyngeal fold. The palatopharyngeal fold contains the palatopharyngeus muscle, and the two of these muscles bound an area called the fauces. So fauces is Latin for throat, and I know that pharynx is throat, and now fauces is within the oropharynx, and that means throat, but etymology is just like that sometimes. So contained within this space of the fauces, we have a tiny indentation, and that's called the palatine fossa. or fossae on either side. And contained within there is more lymphoid acapsular tissue called the palatine tonsils. Whenever people talk about tonsils, these are the tonsils. But it's not the only lymphoid tissue in this area. So recall that I said that the anterior 2/3 of the tongue are in the oral cavity, the posterior 1/3 of the tongue is in the oropharynx. Well, the portion of the tongue which is in the oropharynx, the surface of it, that dorsal surface of it, is very rugose. It's very bumpy. And we call that the lingual tonsil. And that lingual tonsil is aligning with the pharyngeal portion of the tongue, or the root of the tongue. There's also something that can't be very well seen in this, which is called the epiglottic vallecula. So when I look here, this is the epiglottis. It's one of the major cartilages of the larynx. And that, along with the cricoid cartilage, there's an opening here that can get smaller when someone swallows, such that food and drink move to the esophagus. Well, between it and the tongue is a little bit of a space. Let's take a look at that now. So on the left side, we see the dorsal surface of the tongue. This is the palatoglossal fold. That's the palatopharyngeal fold. There is the palatine fossa with the palatine tonsil in it. Here is the root of the tongue, and we can see the lingual tonsil there. And here we can see the superior portion of the epiglottis. Well, between the root of the tongue and the epiglottis, there are these two scoops. Each is an epiglottic vallecula. Together they are the epiglottic valleculae. If we look at this from a sagittal view, we can see that it forms a little trench, an indentation. And what happens is that those valleculae collect and they trap saliva, such that the saliva don't trigger the deglutition or the swallowing reflex. So this buys you time so that you're not as frequently swallowing. This is also an important landmark for laryngoscopy, or when people use an instrument to view the inside of the larynx, typically the folds, the vocal folds within. And what they do is, for like a Macintosh style blade, that goes in the epiglottic vallecula, and we pull the valleculae and the tongue anteriorly, and that allows for a superior view of the larynx. Now we've talked about all of these various tonsils. Tonsils, as you recall, are acapsular lymphoid tissue. So this is a pharyngeal ring of mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, more malt tissue interspersed with all of these, the rest of the aggregations, or the tonsils. And as we can see here, albeit crude, this would be an anterior view of the pharynx, specifically the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. So this would be like some foodstuffs traveling through the mouth and into the pharynx that way. The uvula would be kind of hanging down like so. What all of this tonsillar tissue does, and it's called Waldeyer's ring of tonsils. We discussed this in lymphatics. Any material that you consume or you breathe in has the opportunity of bumping up against these tonsils, this mucosa, and exposing any antigens that are consumed or breathed in to the lymphatic system, so as to get a jump start on the process of mounting an immune response. So Waldeyer's ring includes the pharyngeal tonsil, the tubal tonsils, those are of the nasopharynx, as well as the palatine tonsils, and the lingual tonsil of the oropharynx. So that leaves us with the laryngopharynx, sometimes called the hypopharynx. So epiglottic cartilage extends out into the laryngopharynx. There is a laryngeal inlet, so this is the space through which air moves between the pharynx and the larynx. That's the anterior boundary. And then as we go down distally, we come to the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage. And that happens to align with the inferior border of the sixth cervical vertebra. So that's the boundary between the laryngopharynx and the opening to the esophagus. Now, the one structure that we can't see here, or the structures that we can't see here, are called the piriform recesses, and they're on either side of the larynx, there and more superficially. And what can happen is that swallowed pills sometimes, or pieces of food, can kind of jam themselves in the laryngopharynx just lateral to this border of the larynx. So they're within the pharynx, but lateral to the larynx. Now let's assess some of the knowledge that we've discussed. Which pharyngeal spaces host significant amounts of lymphoid tissue, especially things like tonsils? Nasopharynx, yep. Oropharynx, yep. Laryngopharynx, nope. Naso and oropharynx, yep. Oro and laryngopharynx, nope. So the best answer would be D, naso and oropharynx. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video.